American Football Stories is brought to you by Coach Paint. Coach Paint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. Coach Paint offers the ability to clearly tellustrate video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with Coach Paint today.
What time is it? Game time! It's gonna be special. They gonna talk about this forever.
Welcome to American Football Stories.
Puts his head down, crashes and spins, and dives. Touchdown!
Bringing together the many perspectives that make up college football in the NFL.
Football is one of the greatest sports ever invented.
From players and coaches.
Believe, baby, believe, baby.
Hey, we playing to win right here, fellas.
To the front office and scouts.
The public is finally beginning to catch up, but they don't even know half the truth.
Us against the world, let's get it.
Your hosts, Robert Parker and Nick Knudsen, bring you American Football Stories.
Welcome to the American Football Stories podcast brought to you by Coach Paint. Today is January 4th, 2021. My name is Nick Knudsen. I'm here with my co-host Robert Parker, and we're going to break down this past weekend's college football playoff. Rob, it wasn't a field I was tremendously excited about. Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, Ohio State. I have a huge problem with the playoff committee. The playoff committee chose to put Ohio State in. They chose to put Notre Dame in. And I know you could argue both those teams earned it. And certainly after this weekend, got to be feeling good about that Ohio State selection. But, hey, still some questions about whether or not a 6-win team deserves to be in the playoffs. I know they certainly showed that they're a better team than Clemson the other day, but what do you think about the choice of these games by the playoff committee before we dive into the games themselves? Like I know Notre Dame on paper handled itself well against Alabama, but I just the level of excitement in these games heading into these games, it wasn't as high as it should be for a college football playoff, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you to a certain extent in that regards. I think anytime you have like the blue blood programs from a rating standpoint and from a fan base standpoint, you know, those fan bases are going to be happy. But I think it gets to a point where if you're a fan base, Cincinnati, if you're, Boise State, or, you're the smaller market teams out there, and it just seems like you never get a shot of actually being in the conversation or getting into actually competing for a playoff spot or in competing for a national championship. So I think that's where, the lines are blurred. But I mean, me personally, if you asked me before the playoffs started, I didn't think Notre Dame should be in. I didn't think Ohio State should be in, but I can kind of understand Ohio State a little bit more than Notre Dame, because if you just look at their roster from a talent standpoint, Ohio State can kind of hold their own against anyone, whether it's Clemson, Alabama, and actually Ohio State proved that they can hold their own. So I think with Ohio State, it was more so the games played, not so much of the talent that they could put on the field, and not so much of them being deserving. Right. I think you can look at Notre Dame and saying, hey, is Notre Dame outmatched talent-wise compared to all the other teams in the college football playoffs? Yes. Does Notre Dame should be there? In my opinion, no. So I think it was more so along the lines with Notre Dame shouldn't be there at all. But when it came to Ohio State, it was more so, they only played 6 games.
Yeah, Ohio State, for me, purely, it was my anger at the Big Ten for trying to cancel the season. It's not an Ohio State problem, but you got to give credit. Ohio State was one of those programs fighting to play, too. So it wasn't an Ohio State thing. It was more of a Big Ten thing where I felt like the conferences should have got together and maybe try to send a Big Ten a message. But this Notre Dame-Alabama game is a perfect example of what's wrong with the playoff right now. You got to stop giving Notre Dame the benefit of the doubt. If Notre Dame earns their way in, like a few years ago when they got smashed by Clemson, they were undefeated. Unquestionably undefeated Notre Dame deserves a playoff spot. But when we see them get housed by a full-strength Clemson and their best bullet point on their resume is, hey, we beat half-strength Clemson, and I know it's better than half, but like we beat like Clemson at 80%. If that's your best bullet point on your resume and you just got housed by 100% Clemson, I think we know the answer to the question of whether or not you're going to make a run in the playoff. And to that point, you get them out of there. And I know Notre Dame is a draw when they're playing well. And I know that people love to hate on Notre Dame too. And that's probably what it feels like I'm doing right now. And I know I wasn't big on this team early in the season and I came around on them. They were playing better ball. But once you got destroyed by Clemson in the ACC title game, that told me what we needed to know. And at that point, why don't you give a chance to an undefeated team like Cincinnati? Why not? We saw them play Georgia well in the Peach Bowl. They ended up losing, but could Cincinnati have not put on the same performance Notre Dame did on Saturday, or was it Friday? On Friday?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, we do have to stop giving the benefit of the doubt to Notre Dame based off tradition and based off what Notre Dame's done in the past. I mean, because it really seems like Notre Dame has been living off the past for so long, and they're one of the teams that can do that because of their big brand. They're a blue blood program, but when you just look at the eye test, it tells you Notre Dame shouldn't be in the college football playoffs. Like, yeah, Ian Book is the all-time winningest quarterback, in Notre Dame football history. But is Ian Book better than Trevor Lawrence? Is Ian Book better than Mac Jones? Is Ian Book better than Justin Fields? No. So is Ian Book better than, Desmond Ridder from Cincinnati? Is Ian Book better than Cal Trask? So it just goes to show you that, Notre Dame is really – I can keep going, dude.
Spencer Rattler.
I can keep going. But it just really seems like Notre Dame, is just getting in because, Notre Dame has that, cult fan base. Notre Dame has that tradition. And it's just like, okay, we know the ratings are going to be high if Notre Dame in. But at the end of the day, as me being a college football fan, I don't care about the ratings. I want to see a good competitive game. And we haven't seen that every time Notre Dame gets into the college football playoffs.
Anyone who thinks that the problem is needed, that we need a playoff expansion, this game should be your argument as to why that's not the case. We do not need to expand these playoffs. Four teams is fine. We just got to pick the right four. Like, stop giving the benefit of the doubt to the Notre Dames of the world. Like, Ohio State was at least undefeated this year. I'm just grumpy about the Big Ten. This Notre Dame team, though, they came in like the Clemson loss told you all you needed to know, and it told you exactly how this Alabama game was going to play out. The one thing I'll give Notre Dame the argument on, like, hey, do you deserve a shot with Alabama over Texas A&M? Probably. Texas A&M had their shot at Alabama, but do you deserve it over Cincinnati? No. Do you deserve it over Coastal? No. And I know the Coastal and Cincinnati lost their bowl games, but that's not the point. The point was they were undefeated. Give those teams a shot. Give those teams a shot. Notre Dame's shot was at Clemson. Texas A&M had a shot at Alabama. Give the teams a shot who haven't had a shot. That's what needs to happen with the college football playoff going forward. We don't need to expand it. We don't even get a good game with 1 versus 4. What do you think 1 versus 8 is going to look like? You think 1 versus 8 is going to be a good looking game? 2 versus 7? I don't think so, man. I don't think so. I think we need to. I think we got it. I think 4 teams is fine for now. Let's roll with it. Let's give these G5 teams a chance when they get it. But we'll talk about that more going forward. Let's dive into the game itself. Hey, you saw this game coming from a mile away in terms of how it ended up playing out. But we did get some fun highlights from it. I mean, the Najee Harris leap over the defensive back, that's going to be an all-time highlight from now until eternity for Alabama, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It kind of seems like Najee Harris is kind of, trademarking the hurdle because, we've seen him do it on numerous occasions, but it just seems like it gets better and better and better every time he hurdles a defender. But you're right about this. This game played out kind of how I thought it would play out, kind of how like you thought it would play out, and probably many other people outside of that Notre Dame fan base thought it would play out. Alabama right now is just a juggernaut. They hit the ground running, from beginning to end. Devontae Smith, not only could Notre Dame guard him, but no one in the country could guard him. So you kind of understood that. But it just really seemed like this Alabama team was clicking on all cylinders. And the only bright spot that this Notre Dame team had was, the freshman running back in Kyron Williams. It really seemed like he was one of the people who was on the field on Notre Dame's side that said, hey, I am capable going up against Alabama. I am, from an athletic standpoint, from a physical standpoint, I should be on the field with these guys. But he was one of the few players on that Notre Dame team that could actually say that.
Devontae Smith, 3 touchdowns on 7 receptions. Mac Jones, just stellar as usual, 25 of 30 for 4 touchdowns. And again, Notre Dame's got the same problem the rest of college football has in general before. I know we're real hard on Notre Dame here, but let's face it, there's not many teams that are playing with Alabama this year. This Alabama team's head and shoulders above college football. I'm excited to watch Ohio State against them. Do I think Ohio State's going to stay within 10 points? If they play like they did against Clemson, they play like a near perfect game, maybe. But this Alabama team, they're good. They're just like, this is one of the best teams we've seen Alabama put on the field in the last few years, and that's saying something.
Yeah, it really is. And it just seems like they can beat you in so many different ways. They can beat you with the running game with Najee Harris. They can beat you in the passing game with, Mac Jones and Devontae Smith and, John Mechie. And they don't even have one of their most explosive players on the field, and that's in Jalen Waddle. But, this defense has kind of picked it up, the last couple of weeks or whatever. I know it was a shootout against, Florida in the SEC championship. But once again, you're talking about going up against a Heisman finalist and Kyle Trask and, probably a top 10 pick in Kyle Pitts and Kadarius Toney. He just boosted his draft stock in Trevon Grimes. So they actually had the weapons to kind of make the game competitive with Alabama compared to, the Notre Dames of the world, who doesn't have a bevy of talent and athletic players to kind of compete with Alabama.
Yeah, Alabama advances to yet another college football playoff final. The championship game is next Monday night on January 11th. But instead of a 5th matchup with Clemson, we're going to get a new one. Ohio State goes down to New Orleans and handles Clemson 49-28. Second quarter was 21-0. The Buckeyes just exploded in this game. Clemson went down the field the first drive of the game. It just looked easy. And you're like, oh boy, here we go. Here we go. Clemson is just going to boat race the Buckeyes. It's not even going to be close. The six game thing is going to be a factor. Like, this Ohio State defense hasn't looked great all year. They let Indiana, do what they wanted against them in the second half. Justin Fields hasn't looked spectacular all year. He's looked solid at times, but it hasn't been like what we saw last year. But the Buckeyes, every time Clemson did anything good, the Buckeyes had an answer and then some. Justin Fields ends up going 22 of 28 for 385 yards, 6 touchdowns. Trey Sermon, 31 carries on 193 yards to follow up on that 331-yard game from the Big Ten title game. Chris Olave, the guy who ran the wrong way last year on that route where Justin Fields threw the interception on the last drive of the game to Nolan Turner for Clemson, ends up getting 6 receptions for 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, and Justin Fields and the deep ball was just a thing of beauty. This Ohio State team not only played great on the offensive side of the ball, but they dominated defensively. After 2 opening touchdowns for Clemson, the Buckeyes allowed 2 touchdowns for the rest of the game. Trevor Lawrence still went for 400 yards, but I'll tell you what, he was harassed all night by that Buckeye defensive line. The Buckeye offensive line got great push all night on the Clemson defensive line. And this thing was an absolute beatdown with Ohio State up by 3 touchdowns for most of the game.
Yeah, I tell you what, it really seemed like Ohio State was clicking on all cylinders. And it seemed like, Clemson got punched in the mouth and they couldn't recover from it. And I don't know if it was the billboard bulletin material that Dabo put out there early on before the matchup saying that, Ohio State is not a top 10 team. They shouldn't be in the college football playoffs. And he actually ranked them 11th. So Dabo was doing a lot of talking before the game, but during the game, he wasn't doing so much talking after that. Trey Sermon, wow. Just to have the performance that he put on, just like you said, Nick, in the Big Ten championship game against Northwestern. And then he follows that up, maybe not with the same statistical performance, on the day against Clemson, but this Clemson defense, I can tell you, is definitely better than this Northwestern defense. And it kind of seemed like Trey Sermon did what he wanted to do with this Clemson defense. And Justin Fields having a game that he had. So it really seemed like this team on both sides of the ball was clicking on all cylinders. Clemson had no answers the whole night. So you tip your hats off to this Ohio State team and Justin Fields for actually raising his draft stock. I know that's crazy. How crazy does that sound that Justin Fields raised his draft stock after this game against Clemson?
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to be talking about Zach Wilson going ahead of him anymore. What's the turning point of this game, Rob? Let's see if we got the same one.
I think, the turning point for me was, when Justin Fields got hit.
Yep.
And, the targeting call. Yeah, the targeting call. I mean, me personally, it seemed like Justin Fields suffered, the brunt of that hit. But once again, he led with his head, the crown of his helmet. And as a player, they tell you see what you hit, and he didn't see what he hit. And it really just seemed like, Justin Fields playing through that injury and just playing through getting banged up or whatever, it kind of galvanized the troops and everyone kind of gave it their all. I think that was probably one of the turning points of the game for me.
I'll tell you what, unlike last year where in the red zone, the Buckeyes had to settle for field goal after field goal, this year, those tight ends were so clutch in the red zone. But so that was a major factor in the win for the Buckeyes. But that hit and Fields gritting it out definitely had an impact on the game. But James Skalski, same guy who got ejected for targeting in the championship game against LSU last year for a helmet-to-helmet hit, gets ejected from this one. What do you think about the targeting rule after seeing it for a few years? It's obviously well-intended. We want to protect the players. The players need it to some degree, because when they're playing, they don't think about that as much. You have to put some tough rules on there to force what you want out of it, and what all it's geared for is player safety. But Justin Fields is running, spins at the last second, is a very mobile quarterback who's tough to bring down, spins at the last second, and Skalski can't perfectly fix his body to get his head up, ends up little sloppiness on the techniques and fundamentals. Anyone who's played any sport, hey, do you golf? Do you play tennis? Do you do any sport? You don't always have the perfect fundamentals. So it's one thing to say oh, well, he didn't have his head up. Yeah, he led with the crown of his head. Technically, the call was correct. Technically, he should be ejected. But what the hell are we doing? I love offensive football, but at some point, you're just making defense impossible to play. And I'll give in that there needs to be some sort of penalty to really discourage it. And if you make it a 5-yard penalty, who cares? Make it a 15-yarder. Give the guy a personal foul. You get 2 personal fouls, you get ejected anyway, right? Make it a strike system on that. Hey, you get 2 personal fouls, right? First call on a fluke call like that, should Clemson lose its key middle linebacker for the rest of the game? Don't you think that had some impact on the game? At what point do we look at it's impacting the competitive balance of games for such a flimsy call?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I'm right there with you, Nick. And we saw the same thing last year in the Clemson, Ohio State game when Sean Wade got ejected. And that ejection was a little bit more controversial than Skalski's ejection. But just like you said, I think we kind of have to make it, we kind of have to make it to if you get a targeting call 2 times, we can't relegate it to the first time. I think we have to give the defense the benefit of the doubt. So just like you said, you get 2 personal fouls, you eject it anyway. So why not make it 2 targeting calls and getting ejected instead of the 1? Just like you said, it's definitely affecting the balance of the game. And I tell you what, when Skalski got ejected, I tell you what, that defense, that Clemson defense was definitely deflated.
It was. And Scott, he's awesome, by the way. I watched some tape on him leading up to the game, and he's incredible. Awesome player, and he's been a key piece of that Clemson defense. We saw he was one of their pieces that was missing for the Notre Dame game. So losing him was a big deal. And you know what? I'm not making excuses for Clemson. Ohio State got screwed on a couple calls last year, including a fumble that was a touchdown. You can't argue. You can't tell me that one wasn't a touchdown last year against Clemson. Ohio State had some bad calls go against them last year. So Clemson, you get one this year. The call was correct, but it was a bad break for Clemson. Let me put it that way. But when you're up by 3 touchdowns at halftime, that effectively eliminates Travis Etienne from the game plan in terms of running the ball. I mean, you saw Clemson end the night with 44 yards rushing. I don't think this game really sends a message in terms of what the future of Clemson or Ohio State is. Ohio State lost 31-0 to the Tigers a few years ago, and here we are a few years ago with Ohio State, a few years later with Ohio State kicking their ass. So I think this is just a good rivalry now, and we could call it a rivalry now that the Buckeyes are on the board. Dabo running his mouth didn't help Clemson, but I'll say this Buckeye team remembered that loss last year, and they didn't need any extra motivation. So I think the Dabo thing is a little overplayed because I think that was fun to talk about and everything, but I think this Buckeye team, I think they were ready to go. I think they were ready to go, Dabo talking or not talking. But how do you feel about Ohio State going into the national championship game against Alabama? And do you think Justin Fields' injury is going to do you think – I mean, dude, do you see what he got hit? Did he break a rib or anything? Did he do something to his hip? Did you see him trying to get on a bike like an old man?
Yeah, I don't know if he broke a few ribs or he bruised some ribs, but I tell you what, something definitely happened in that particular area of the body because you just saw him wincing and you saw him gritting it out the whole entire game.
Lower back on your ribs, that's like such a sense. Getting hit like that in that spot, oh God, that's not a protected spot either.
Yeah, I just kind of feel I understand the hit. I understand the call, but just like you said, it kind of seems like Clemson got a bad break, but hey, that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. But I tell you what, I expect Justin Fields to get hit like that going up against this Alabama defense. Maybe not targeting in that particular sense, but more physical of the hits because of the SEC play and the way that Alabama plays on defense. And in order for Ohio State and Justin Fields to win this game and win the national championship, he's going to have to go into his Deshaun Watson bag of tricks and play like Deshaun Watson did when he knocked off Alabama a couple years ago.
Yeah. So that being said, give us a quick breakdown of Ohio State and Alabama on Monday night.
I think it's going to be closer than what most people will expect. I think Justin Fields, just the weapons that he had on the outside with Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, and just like you said, those tight ends are stepping up. So we know the formula to beat Alabama is that you have to throw the ball downfield. We saw LSU, with Joe Burrow beat Alabama by throwing the ball downfield. We saw Kyle Trask stay competitive with Alabama by throwing the ball downfield. We've seen Ole Miss beat Alabama, couple years by throwing the ball downfield and by attacking the secondary. So that's how Ohio State is going to win this game. So if Justin Fields can throw the ball downfield accurately and hit his weapons, and he can kind of have a clean pocket, but he can also make those plays with his feet. And then if Trey Sermon can kind of run the way he's been running the last couple of weeks, I think that's the recipe to beat Alabama. But once again, I think it's more so on the defense side of the ball with Ohio State. They're going to have to come up with some stops, because if they don't come up with stops against Alabama, then they're going to lose the game.
Yeah, the defensive matchup is going to be very interesting to watch. I don't see anyone stopping Alabama, so I think it's going to be about outscoring them. You saw an A+ performance in the Sugar Bowl, and you got to bring about that same level against Alabama. It's certainly possible. We saw this a couple of years ago when Ohio State made their playoff run. I'm going back to 2014 when they upset Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, and then they beat Mariota and Oregon coming off a big win against Florida State. Ohio State just kept it up, and they played hot at the right time of year. And I think the key figure is Trey Sermon. If Trey Sermon can keep it going, and I'll tell you what, the offensive line, if the Buckeyes can maintain that physicality against Alabama, if they play like they did again in the Sugar Bowl, Ohio State could definitely win this game. No doubt. I mean, Justin Fields, you talk about going downfield. He's got those guys, Chris Olave. We saw multiple players catch touchdowns downfield. And what really emerged in the Ohio State offense that you hadn't seen all season, those tight ends were awesome against Clemson. They were incredible against Clemson. So if you can have that type of varied attack where you can attack the middle of the field, you can attack downfield, and you got to defend Trey Sermon, how do you defend that? How do you defend? It's just like Alabama on the other side. I think I heard the over-under for this game was around in the high 70s, Rob. Have you seen one?
Yeah, I did see the over unders in the high 70s, and I
Yeah.
tell you what, that just like you said, if Ohio State, it's Ohio State can win this game in a couple of different ways. Just like you said, they can win the game by outscoring Alabama and it turn it into a shootout with Justin Fields throwing the ball around, or they can kind of win the game by winning it in the trenches with the offensive line and Trey Sermon running the ball, keeping that explosive Alabama team off the field. Or they can win it, by on the defense side of the ball with coming up with a couple of, big time stops or whatever like that on the defense side of the ball, which gives the ball back to, Ohio State and that offense. So I think Ohio State has a recipe to kind of win this game. They sure knew they're not talent riddled like, Notre Dame. I think they have way more talent than Notre Dame, and they can be competitive than Notre Dame.
They should be competitive. I said we saw Florida hang. I think the Florida game's a good comparison. We've seen Ole Miss. If you have an offense that can put up points, this Alabama defense is susceptible. So I don't look at Alabama as the complete Death Star, unbeatable machine here, but you have to have an offense that can score and outpace that offense. And what did Ohio State do in this game? They went out there. They were able to jump on Clemson early. It wasn't even like a big turnover fest either. That was the funny part. Is it's not like Clemson turned the ball over 4 times. It was 2-1. Ohio State outpaced them 2-1 on the turnovers. It literally was. Ohio State was just going down the field, scoring every time, and they put that type of pressure on Clemson to the point where the run game became moot in the second half. So if you can put pressure on Alabama and Alabama's keeping up with you, that's another way to get it done. But I mean, really, the recipe for success, it looks a lot like it did against Clemson. Maintain physicality at the lines, dominate in the trenches. I don't see that happening twice in a row. So I definitely would think Bama is going to get it done in Miami. But Ohio State, if they play like they did against Clemson, they're fully capable of doing this again against Alabama. As crazy as it seems.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's far-fetched. I think just like you said, they have the talent that they need to beat Alabama. You have the quarterback, you have the receivers, you have the running back. You have the offensive line who's physical, and it seems like that offensive line is clicking on all cylinders now. I know they were down a couple players the last couple of games, but it really seems like that offense is getting back with Wyatt Davis and Nicholas Petit. So I think they do have the talent to beat Alabama. So if Alabama was to go down to Ohio State, I wouldn't be shocked and I wouldn't be surprised.
Can't wait. It's gonna be a fun game. It's gonna be a fun game, and that's why when we talk about the college football playoff not being right, I don't have a lot of complaints about the college football final. I am tired of watching Alabama and Clemson, but if Clemson would have won this game, hey, those are the two best teams, right? So I am excited though that we're gonna get a fresh matchup. We haven't seen Ohio State and Alabama play since that 2014 Sugar Bowl. These are two programs that are constantly in the hunt for the national title over the last decade here, and it's going to be a blast to watch this one on Monday night. Justin Fields goes up against Mac Jones. Hey, look, if you're the Buckeyes, you got to feel good going into this game. I know Alabama's always confident, but I don't. This Buckeye teams, they're not gonna be bowing the knee. They're not gonna be afraid. They're gonna come out there and they're gonna be throwing some haymakers. And I think with Ryan Day, I think if there's one, I can't wait to watch the coaching matchup, like the different strategy that Day's going to come out with, because I think Day is one of the best coaches in America, but he just doesn't have the track record for everybody to know it yet. And I think people look at him as the guy who inherited the program from Urban Meyer still. And if you look at Ryan Day that way, you haven't been following the Buckeyes very closely in his first 2 seasons, because he has made strides in that program from where Meyer left it. And they're not only that, but these two teams are going to be right back in it next year and the following year, because they just keep reloading at a really high level. Both teams are Ohio State. Did you see Ohio State picked up a 5-star corner out of Florida yesterday?
Yeah, I don't see Ohio State and Alabama falling off no time soon.
Yeah.
Just like you said, year in year out, they just add fuel. They just add fuel to the fire. It's never rebuild mode for those guys for those two teams. And I know Steve Sarkisian actually is taking the Texas job, but once again, they're not going to miss any beat. They're going to bring another big time coach coming in. I think you mentioned it. You call it the Nick Saban rehab.
Yeah, that's what everyone calls it.
Yeah,
the Nick Saban coaching rehab clinic.
Coaching rehab clinic, and I think it's going to continue as long as Nick Saban is there. So
by the way, did you see who his two? The report just came out. It says his two top candidates for the OC job in Tuscaloosa: Adam Gase, freshly fired from the Jets, and Bill O'Brien.
Oh wow! Now we're really going into the coaches rehab clinic right now.
Even the NFL fired NFL coaches are know that Nick Saban. Once you're washed by Nick Saban, you're fresh and ready to go. I could spend an entire episode talking about Texas and Sark, but we'll do an off-season podcast on the Longhorns and that whole thing. That was pretty stunning to me. I don't think we're going to see any Sark, any type of Lane Kiffin FAU issues, are we? Are we going to see Sark get fired 2 days before the game?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see that. I actually think Sark kind of sees this thing out. He actually scheme up something for the national championship, and I think he shows Nick Saban that he's thankful and he's grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah. I do too. I think he'll see. It's only a few more days. It's one more week. What are you really buying at this point for a week's worth of recruiting in Texas? You'll bounce back. You'll get your shot. I can't wait for this game. We'll do an episode later in the week, really previewing it. We'll dive deeper into it. But good look at it. Good recap of the playoffs. Rob, you got anything else you want to add before we go out?
Yeah, not too much. I'm just excited that we actually get a good matchup, and I think Ohio State is not outmanned like a lot of people would think. From the outside looking in, I really think they have the talent to keep up with Alabama, and it proves. And this is why they're in the top 5 on the recruiting trail, like year in and year out. So let's see those 5-star recruits that Ohio State's been getting in the last years make a difference in this game.
Yep, both teams have dominated their conference, but this is the moment they're built for. They're building to play each other, not necessarily to play Vanderbilt Northwestern all the time. So, Rob, good episode. Good look back at the college football playoff, and we will send our listeners out with a word from our sponsor, Coach Paint.
American Football Stories is brought to you by Coach Paint. Coach Paint is a great tool that allows us to add graphics to player highlight clips similar to the graphics you see on TV. Coach Paint offers the ability to clearly tell a straight video while increasing retention of information in a shorter amount of time. Up your game with Coach Paint today.
Thank you for listening to American Football Stories podcast. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, American Football Stories. We are working to grow our network on YouTube and we'd love to have you subscribe. You can find us also on Apple Podcasts, on Twitter, at American FB Story, and on our website, AmericanFootballStories.com. I am Robert Parker. My co-host is Nick Knudsen. This has been another episode of American Football Stories.